Hey, it's Kyle here, and today we're in Kerbal Space Program 2. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, the first patch for the game is live, so we're going to have a bit of a look at what those changes are. Secondly, a little birdie told me that due to the lack of heating and aero effects, you can actually fly through Kerbal, i.e. the sun, in the middle of the Kerbal system. Oh, and third, I said I'd do this in the planning update, so here we are. So let's get started with a new sandbox campaign, and I've made up a new flag which is a bit more difficult to bring into the game compared to the original. You actually need mods. Yeah. So we'll come to that a little bit later in the video on how modding works, but first up, let's set our agency colors, which really does need a hex code field for input, and come up with an agency name as well, because CAXA is just for career mode. So let's go with Kolnya Space Agency, which is a Kerbal spin on a Molnya orbit, a highly elliptical angled orbit used by old Soviet communication satellites. So with that all sorted, let's jump into the game. Unsurprisingly, we're starting in KSP2's shiny new vehicle assembly building, which handles building both rockets and aircrafts. And from the outset, I tried to do this properly. I wanted to make a nuclear tanker which would be able to make its way to the sun under its own power. No modding, no cheating, no exploits, just the stock parts in KSP2. Now, you might be able to guess already that this isn't going to be the case. I thought I'd come up with a pretty reasonable design, which I'm very confident would work well in original KSP. We had both nuclear and Methalox engines, some nicely positioned Mark III tanks that curved around the big hydrogen orbs, plenty of structural supports and strutting in place to make it rigid and stable, and a whole heap of supporting boosters that kept the center of mass, thrust and lift well balanced along the craft. But after 4 hours of fighting the broken and freeze-prone UI, disappearing struts, rapid disassembly on the launch pad, and even a forced reboot of my PC by the game, I gave up. And for context, I'm not gaming on a potato. My computer has a Ryzen 5900X, 64GB of RAM and a 3070 Ti, so it's certainly no slouch. KSP2 is not in a stable enough state to handle these types of massive crafts, and every time I loaded the craft onto the pad, even with well-distributed support arms on every part, it would simply collapse and explode when it loaded in. Even with a slimmed down version, there were other issues with it following the laws of physics and fuel flow, with it randomly flipping over even with fuel distribution and flow set up correctly. So I ditched my plans for our nice nuclear hauler, and instead focused on the mission at hand, getting ourselves deep inside Kerbal without exploding. We're going bare bones here. We have a mothership and a lander. I've turned on unlimited fuel, manually changed the structural rigidity settings in KSP2's configuration file, and we're just going to see what happens here. So this time around everything worked pretty well, and we have an uneventful launch and on our way to a nice stable orbit. Now I'm not sure how Bill ended up solo on this mission when I loaded up a whole team of Kerbonauts for this one, but I'm going to say an error occurred between the keyboard and the chair and take the hit. With all the trialing and testing, I did not check the crew until we were much later in the mission, rendering our landing craft mostly pointless. Further to this, and frustratingly, the audio is also missing from all the recordings, so for now you'll have to imagine the epic sounds the folks at Private Division managed to capture from the Atlas V launch for the game, at least until I figure out what is wrong in OBS for the next KSP2 video. So we're flying in the latest version of KSP2, which has a shopping list and a half of changes, bug fixes, tweaks and improvements compared to the version launched in late February 2023. And some of these improvements help with really problematic issues, such as trajectories disappearing when loading a game, issues with decouplers and docking, which is not completely solved, more on that later, the Kerbal Space Center spawning in orbit, navball control issues, Delta V issues reverting to launch-breaking vessels and game shutdown during time warp issues, and that's just in the flight and map section, and not all of it. There's still a long way to go to get the game into a stable, playable state, especially with the UI and how part physics are behaving. However, a lot of these tweaks have already improved the game experience substantially compared to launch. So if you've not had a read through the list in full, it's worth having a look. I've put the link to the patch notes on Steam in the video description, as there's way too many things to cover in this video and some of them are kind of minor tweaks. One thing that I'm very glad they've taken seriously is how intercepts are displayed and how orbital markers can now be right-clicked on the map screen to keep them visible, like in KSP 1. It's been a big improvement already, and while not perfect, it makes executing burns and flight planning substantially better. Now, I say better, not good here, as there are still a lot of bugs with flight planning and maneuvers, along with how Delta V is calculated, drained, and so on. So credit where it's due, but we've got a long road ahead of us. Anyway, back to the mission. This is where we started to run into a few issues. And as you can see on the screen right now, for some reason my craft is covered, and I mean absolutely covered, in temperature warning dials. Now, in the patch notes, there is no mention of re-implementing thermal conditions throughout Kerbal, so they're still not in place. However, it does look like the warning systems are now active, and even turning them off in the settings doesn't turn them off. For now at least, other than being an eyesore, the gorges aren't much of a problem. So let's get our orbit as low as we can and see what happens. Once we got our periapses inside the star, I quick saved and reloaded the game, and that seemed to get rid of the heating info problem. But just as I was doing some beauty shots for the title card, disaster struck. Now, at first I had no idea what had happened. My first thought was the issue might be patch related. Perhaps the developers implemented an impact zone for Kerbol and we could no longer pass inside it. So just in case, I rolled back my KSP2 install to the launch version and ran into the exact same problem. Was it speed related? No. Was it angle related? Also no. Was it the size of the craft? Nope. But each of these incidents had something in common. They all happened around the 600 kilometer mark above the surface of Kerbal, and funnily enough, I was using time warp at exactly that time and location. So what would happen at 600 kilometers if we didn't use time warp? Yep, it turns out that if you use time warp at Kerbal while under 600 kilometers, you will be vaporized. Now, I don't know exactly why this happens for sure, but here's my best guess. The game doesn't expect a craft to be this close to Kerbal's surface, so it assigns the craft a state only meant to be assigned when a craft burns up in the star's atmosphere. We still have our full bar of time warp options below, so it definitely hasn't been assigned a landed state, as we'd be limited up to 4 times physics time warp. So let's dive a little further and see what happens when we get into the negatives. And there we have it, we're inside Kerbal, though strangely not underneath its outer shell. Our orbit has now changed from a collision orbit back to a normal spacebound one, and on top of that, we're now limited to 4 times time warp, suggesting the region is either considered to be inside a planet's atmosphere, which is likely, or it thinks we're on a planet's surface. At minus 34,000 meters, we pass through the outer shell of the star and discover another star inside, which looks to be the game's primary light source. Now, seeing as we have nothing in the way, let's open up these solar panels and see how crazy our energy flow is. We're peaking at around 92,000 energy credits a second, enough to fill literally any battery system you haul into space almost instantly. And with that, I'd say that's mission accomplished, and we could sit here running loops around Kerbal's insides, but we have another question to answer. Can we leave Kerbal once we've gotten inside it? As much as I'd like to play around here, we've got a slight problem. I never saved before we left.
Oopsie whoopsie boo.
And as poor Bill is our lone brave Kerbanaut, I'd really like to get him home. So how do we do this? Let's power up these engines and start burning away from Kerbal's core as if we're launching from the surface. The moment the periapsis rotates around our orbital path to us, we're going to start burning prograde to make use of the O-berth effect to maximize the gains to our apoapsis and increase our speed. The plan here is to burn non-stop as we raise our orbit's high point while using 4 times times warp. The moment we're about to surface out of the sun again, we're going to drop back to 1 times warp so we don't disintegrate, and wait until we exceed 600 kilometers before even looking at that button again. Fair warning, this took ages, and even utilizing the O-Earth effect to maximize our Apple Access games, we're talking a good 30 minutes of burning non-stop. I actually left the room, went and made a cup of tea, talked to my other half, cleaned the cat's litter tray, and then came back, and our highest point was still inside Moho's orbit. But eventually the delta V we've poured into this maneuver starts to pay off, as the O-Earth effect truly kicks in and our Apple Access accelerates out past the orbit of Juno. And that's exactly where we want it to be, so now all that's left to do is wait for us to surface. Conveniently, as you get close to the surface, the game's time warp auto stops you when you are close to a celestial body, so that works out great to keep ourselves from exploding here. So while Brave Bill continues his long and winding journey home, let's talk about modding in KSP 2. At the moment there's only a few mods out, and most of them are realistically quality of life improvements. As always, everything I mention here has a link in the video description in case you're looking to install it. So let's start from the top. Modding seems to be based around a combo mod called Space Warp plus BepInEx, which were both separate projects that are now combined together on SpaceDock. This is essentially the key to unlock KSP2 for modding, creating a mod folder and activating them. Next, I installed 2 mods to speed up the boot of the game, mostly due to the frustrations I was facing on the amount of crashes I've had and other issues. First is Speedy Startup, which gets the game to start loading its assets during the logo splash screens, instead of after they've all played. The second was the No Seizure Warning mod, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It removes the seizure warning in the credits. Obviously, if you or someone you share a computer with has epilepsy or is prone to seizures, you should probably not install this mod, or I guess even play Kerbal as far as the warning suggests. But in my case, we're good, and it means 1 less splash screen to sit through. And finally, to add our own custom flags, I installed, wait for it, custom flags. Yup, again does exactly what it says on the tin. It is worth mentioning though that if you had custom flags in KSP1, they are not going to be the right size for KSP2. The new flags are wider and taller and look like they need to be in a PNG format, so no JPEGs for you. I haven't tried GIFs, but it would be hilarious to have an animated flag. The new dimensions you need to make your flag are 512 pixels wide by 300 pixels tall. I've put these in the video description in case you need them. So back to the mission at hand, and we're almost safely home. The limited aerodynamics and heating certainly makes it an unusual experience to re-enter Kerbin for the KSC with accuracy, and this did take me a couple of goes to get right. As we have no landing legs that can handle this rocket's weight, and no parachutes packed because I'm an idiot, I decided to aim for the lake next to the launch pads. Now, something I did forget to mention during this whole process is that the docking port between the two crafts stopped working, so there was no chance to disconnect and land with just the lander here. I'd instantly get a craft destroyed message and I'd be unable to regain control of the ship even though it was still intact. Thankfully, I managed to get the splashdown in the lake and we were able to return Bill to the active roster after a delicious restorative diet of snacks following his 7-year mission. And that is where we're going to leave things this time around. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed our first proper foray into KSP2. The next video in the new game will be a bit more of a proper mission, heading out to Jool for the first time. However, the next video we'll be returning to the Artemis program and expanding our lunar gateway with its first supply mission before heading back to Korea Strategia for a Mun landing. As always, mods and any links will be in the video description below, but until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next pass.